Just I'll remind you of one thing and
Yeah.
that'll get us there.
I'm gonna delay starting the meeting until we at least have 3 or 4 commission members on here. Wait, Ellie.
Jill, right?
I don't remember. Did she say that?
And she said. I'm just trying to actually.
Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started.
Oh, yes.
So we'll go ahead and get started. We do have 4 commission members in person or online total. So others will be joining us. Here we go. I'm just going to turn this right over to Ellen, because the first item is welcome and introduction. So yeah, I expect you have something planned for that.
I do. Hoping I have. Oops. All right, one moment, guys. I'm just trying to get my documents.
You want to do the public comment?
Sure, yeah, we can do public comments. now.
So, while Emily finds her materials, we've been open to public comments. These would be items that are not on the agenda, so if you have anything you'd like to propose or mention to the planning commission that is outside the bounds of either the village bylaw community meeting or the form-based code, feel free to speak up. Anybody online? Public comment? Okay.
All right, so I'm realizing one of my PowerPoints, because I don't have file access, I don't have access to, so I'll just give a spoken introduction. But welcome everybody to the Village Bylaw Community Meeting of September 20th. I recognize several faces in this room, so I can be fairly brief, but folks have been involved since early July when we launched the Village Bylaw Revision Project to update the zoning. Where we are currently in the village zoning district. So the walking tour posters went up throughout town, the surveys were launched, the website was launched. Property owners were each mailed, and including businesses and tenants and residents in the village, to really do a broad public outreach to make sure everybody knew about this bylaw revision. Then there have been over, I think, about 100 survey responses received, and over reviews of the virtual tour that's available online. I've had 4 meetings with individuals about their properties and how this would impact, the bylaw revision would impact their properties. The walking tour that was hosted back in July was well attended with 15 to 18 people. So overall, there's been broad public outreach to date, and that will continue. The posters will come down at the end of this week after this rain. They are especially tired. But I'm going to keep all the online forums open and available pretty much until the Planning Commission gives something to the select board. Tonight's focus is going to be on some of the changes that the Planning Commission is considering. So first, I'll start by sharing the bylaw document. We have copies available here, and folks can request one if they need it in copy person. You'll notice the one I'm screen sharing has all these little strikeout comment boxes. I've basically been taking a master list of things I hear from the Planning Commission, things I hear from the public. A lot of the one-on-one meetings were really helpful too, because I read a sentence and I'm like, that's actually not reading as clearly as it should be. And how can we keep evolving this document to be functional and effective? So I'm working on, taking everybody's input and distilling it down in. Soon we'll have a revised version of this with our consultant that will, update this document. The Planning Commission had a meeting on August 2nd and talked through some major considerations of things that they would like to. There's roughly 8 topic areas. Some of them are more discrete than others. The first was simplify the permit thresholds in the process. That table that I've striked out, I wrote it and it still needed some refinement to simplify it. I think I'm there with what the proposal would be to simplify permit thresholds so they follow the normal thresholds throughout town. When does something have to go to the development review board review versus when does something just get approved by the administrator? And then clarifying that certificate of appropriateness requirement. And I also added an important clarification here that things that would just require certificate of appropriateness don't need that duplicative permit. So someone who's, replacing their windows on a historic home, rather than having them pay a permit and pay it, and no one else in the town would be required to do, just say you get your certificate for that activity. You don't require additional permits and fees. The certificate of appropriateness has always been a free thing. It doesn't have a fee associated with it, and we'll retain that. So that's an update on the permit thresholds and process. And it looks like a couple other folks joined in on Zoom, so welcome. I'm just giving an overview. A major topic we'll talk about tonight will be minimally visible or invisible from the street. And this is sort of a work in progress. The Planning Commission has expressed interest in not only greater flexibility for materials that are visible on the street, particularly on historic structures, but things that happen to the side or rear of a home that would be less visible. So if a property owner were to make a change to their land, they would have more flexibility with what to do with it. And minimally visible would mean, when you stand on the street, if you're looking at something straight on, that's fully visible. But if you're only seeing the side of it from an angle for a limited period of time, that would be minimally visible. And of course, invisible is, to the rear. The Planning Commission's also expressed an interest in maximum footprint size. So I looked at what the average footprint sizes are of structures in the village. And this would be, a maximum cap on development. If we're going away from dwellings as density in terms of units per acre and allowing some more expanded commercial uses, making sure that new buildings and new additions are not too big for the village. So for example, the Federated Church and its parish hall are each 5,000 square feet. The National Guard Armory Building is 15,000 square feet. The Ayurvedic Center, the British house on the corner by the stop sign, that is about 3,300 square feet, and then that rear building behind it is 1,200. So I looked at all of these square footages, propose a maximum footprint of 2,500 square feet for something that has frontage on the street. And then for a rear building, like a barn, could look a little larger, around 3,500 square feet. Building height, the Planning Commission has expressed interest in keeping that at 36, but clarifying how it's measured. So currently building height is measured at average finished grade, which means the structure could be mounded up. And then when you're standing on the sidewalk or the street, it'll feel taller. This measurement would be 36 feet at pre-construction grade. So what you're experiencing as a pedestrian or as an abutter will be slightly smaller. And in line with some of the standards in form-based code, also adding a metric where it's limited to 2 stories and an attic story. There are no complete 3-story buildings in the village. In fact, most things are 1, 1.5, 2 stories. And the exceptions would be churches, where they are much taller. They have vaulted ceilings. A topic that we'll go into further tonight as well is the location of commercial uses. And I'll be brief here because we'll go into it more in the Mentimeter. We're also working on a better intent page for general site planning. In general, the Planning Commission and the public has said things. Yeah, we want variety of uses and structures, but in general, the village is things that look like or feel like single-family homes in massing and scale and detailing, and commercial uses are built to meet that pattern. Required private open area. So the proposal here I have based on the parcel size. I looked at the smallest parcels in the village and also some larger ones to get a feel for what their current backyards are on average. And that the outdoor area would be something that's, located out of wetlands and buffers, located out of side and rear setbacks. And you couldn't include, a large front yard in that metric. I think of it as the grill test. Like, where would you want to flip a burger in your t-shirt and shorts? It's probably not the front yard. And it might be the side yard if you can screen it with a fence. So making sure that development doesn't take up the whole site with the building and parking and setbacks, that there is some minimum outdoor area for people to have a backyard. And here's some case study photos. So I looked at, among other properties, right across the street, 7921 Williston Road, which is under renovation to be the orthodontist office. Their patio and some of its surrounding lawn is about 2,300 square feet. The lot is exactly a ½ acre. And then the smallest parcel in the village, 16 Whitney Hill, it's 0.12 acres. And that they have about 1,200 square feet, including their deck. And that did not include their garden space that is in their wider front and side setbacks to the street. The last topic the Planning Commission has been working with is solar. And that current draft that people have hard copies of is very restrictive on solar. I checked in with the state offices, and there's a lot of nuance in state law, and solar that is connected to the grid and permitted, permitted through the state. Municipalities have very limited scope of regulation that they can have over state connected solar. So we can say things like, if you're going to put solar on a building with a slate roof, you can't do things that you wouldn't do otherwise. You can't rip off architectural detailing, and you'd have to show us, can the structure support it? Are you doing it in a way that is going to not damage the integrity of other parts of the building, which are pretty much baseline metrics for putting solar on any structure. So those are some of the greater topics that the Planning Commission is thinking about. And I'm going to pivot now. Actually, I guess before we go into the live survey, I'm wondering, does anybody have any initial questions or thoughts before we go into part 2?
I'll just comment that you're pretty close on all of them. Feel like you've struck a good balance for the most part. There are a couple where I'm gonna suggest we nudge it and with it, but you did a good job.
So for the next portion of the meeting, we're going to do a live survey on Mentimeter. So you could do this on your computer or on your smartphone. We'll be responding to live survey questions. Let me share. That's. So can everyone see this screen on Zoom? You'll go to menti.com and use the code that's on the screen. I'm also going to drop a direct link into the chat. You can click on that link and it'll take you to Menti. And the folks who are on your computer, you can scan the QR code with your smartphone as well.
You can use both and submit 2 votes.
A whole array of phones.
Early in office.
Cool. Is everyone able to see this? I can get going on some of the survey questions. And at any time, feel free to message me in the Zoom chat or raise your hand if you're having any technical issues. So we'll get going on our first question. This is one for practice. One word to describe Williston Village. You should be able to enter multiple entries. Cool. We have words like home, rural, quaint, traffic, cute but brief, aspirational, center of civic life, walkable, peaceful, historic, fragmented, bedroom community. I'll keep it open for another moment. Needs a cafe.
It's a lot of words.
So the proposed edits, those are some of the overarching topics, the 8 topics that I just discussed. And we're going to do some broad brush survey questions on some of these topic areas. So commercial uses. Today, they are allowed throughout the village zoning district. Granted, there is a very limited list of commercial uses. So a thing like a cafe or a coffee shop might not be allowed because what's only allowed is a full service restaurant. And there's some other limits too on commercial uses where we've seen, the whole economy change during COVID. Takeout's more common, small shops and local businesses are more important than ever, and how can we support them? So what the proposal is to broaden commercial uses and focus on some of their nuisances that aren't compatible with the village, like dumpster enclosures, outdoor patios, screening. The current bylaws also have standards about odor, noise, glare, so things that generate nuisances that wouldn't be compatible with the neighbor. And as proposed, most of the commercial uses are limited to just Williston Road, where there's frontage along the main busy street. And then elsewhere, residentially based uses like senior living, assisted living, maybe a small bed and breakfast could be allowed because they are far more compatible with other residential properties. So the question tonight is, should we keep it as is, where most commercial uses are just limited to Williston Road? Or should they expand to side streets like Oak Hill Road, North Williston Road, or Old Stage? One of the Planning Commission's discussions that didn't have any resolution was those are busier town roads. They're not quiet dead ends, but they have some traffic, less traffic than Williston Road, but are still a part of the village area. So would it be okay to have some of the commercial uses you would allow on Williston Road on those side streets like Old Stage, North Williston, or Oak Hill? Or if you don't agree with either of those, you can say you have another idea. And then if we can talk about that in the open discussion. Participants.
Weapon responses.
Yeah.
I just did a no vote and went through, so mine might be one of the 11, but it's not
Okay.
a larger.
Yeah, I think we have about 13 folks attending tonight, including commissioners. So I can keep it open another moment. So we're going to pivot the discussion on commercial uses to think about home businesses.
Do you want to hear I have another idea or?
Yeah, do you want to do that now?
Well, I didn't know, when did you want to hear the other idea? There was no type in option, all you could say is I have another
Right.
idea.
Yeah, let's do that now, just so we don't forget towards the end of the meeting.
The first thing I'd say is I would have voted for the second option if I hadn't said I have another idea. Because I don't understand limiting it beyond functionality. In other words, nobody wants to put a business that's gonna have much traffic, I don't think, on a dead end. And we're putting in here all these things about being compatible with what's next door. And so I don't quite understand why we need to say you can't have a business on any particular street as long as it meets the requirements. And somebody may want to do something that we aren't thinking of, and we've said you can't do it. And I can think of several examples. I don't know if we consider Forrest, is it Forrest White? If we consider his a business because he parks his truck there sometimes with a sign on the side of it. If he were on Old Stage Road, I don't think people would be complaining, or if he, then would they complain if you were on Maple Road? you know, I don't know. Or if somebody had a yarn shop that was a small and relatively quiet and infrequent clientele, would that not be okay on Maple Road? So I don't understand the logic of saying no commercial, except on certain streets. I do understand limiting it by all the ways that we're limiting it in this. And so maybe somebody could explain to me that we really need to say no commercial.
Yeah. That's a great point, and let's circle back to that when we go to open discussion. And I think some of this could be answered by home businesses. So home businesses are a separate section of the bylaw. And they're currently limited to where the owner or operator lives on the site. And there are some floor area limits, 25% of the dwelling or 750 square feet, whichever is smaller. Currently in the village, home businesses cannot have any outdoor storage or workspaces. And any parking, additional parking or more than 2 evening trips. So basically, like if you're a piano teacher and you have more than 2 people coming and going in the evening, you would automatically have to go to the DRB for those additional vehicle trips and additional parking. Outdoor lighting is limited to that of a residential home. And home businesses that would need a state permit for hazardous materials, air quality, serious pollutants, those are not permitted as a home business. That would trip your threshold into commercial use. Home businesses are permitted administratively, and if that person who operates it moves off site, that home business then goes away because that operator has to live there. So the question for folks tonight is if you agree or disagree with some of those provisions in the code for home businesses and if they should change. For example, allowing an increased square footage. The current limit is 750 square feet or 25% of the home. Would you be okay with home businesses that have some outdoor storage or work areas, provided that they don't have nuisances like noise, odor, dust? For example, if a woodsmith keeps all his machinery in the garage, but maybe stores some lumber next to his garage. Would it be okay if home businesses have more vehicle trips or parking? If they're on Williston Road, and is that different than home businesses that are on a side street with vehicle trips? So there's options here where you can strongly agree or strongly disagree with these 4 statements. And if you put the slider in the middle, that would be a more neutral opinion.
It's a nice little system, by the way.
Yeah. This is fun.
And they're good questions you asked.
Thank you.
And I'm not trying to convince anybody or something, but when I think about the history of the village, home businesses were the history of the village, you know, everybody was a home business practically. You know, if you were a farrier, you had a farrier business in your backyard.
Mhm. I would say even our truly commercial businesses that exist today, many of them are still home businesses where the person lives on site or very close by.
Remember Ed Miles?
Mhm.
The bicycle repair that.
Yeah, it's like, cool, so it looks like everybody has responded to the survey. slate roofs. This is probably going to be one of the more, challenging topics that the planning commission is working through. And it makes sense that it's a topic that the planning commission should grapple with, as opposed to the development review board and impact committee. Because when the standards are vague, they treat those standards differently on an ad hoc basis, depending on who's interpreting those standards. So materials questions should really be a policy decision that's made by the planning commission and the select board. So everybody has a fair experience. To date, there are 8 slate roofs remaining in the village of various sizes, from just a turret to a whole house, and the other additions are a different material. Of those 8 slate roofs, 2 are on municipal buildings, the town hall and Old Brick Church. 2 are on commercial buildings, and 4 are on residential buildings. Slate is extremely long lasting, but it does require significant upfront costs that can be prohibitive to many people. And it also requires regular maintenance when slates fall off, getting them put back on by a skilled craftsman. A challenge with slate is that owner-occupied homes are not eligible for state or federal tax credits. So businesses and municipalities can take advantage of tax credits to pay for historic preservation repairs, but a homeowner cannot access that same funding. To date, the DRB has not approved synthetic slate over concerns about its long-term durability. To my knowledge, I think there's one house in Meadow Ridge that has synthetic slate. That's not a historic home. It's a relatively new material that's on the market, so its durability, especially in the Vermont climate, is yet to be determined. Most of the historic properties that are in the village have another material like asphalt shingles or metal roofs, and they were likely put on prior to there being any zoning or any historic review in the village, in the era of the 50s to the early 80s. And I will note that this photo is not, all the photos that are in this PowerPoint are specifically not of Williston. So the question tonight for this slate question is, should slate be required to remain? So the 8 properties that have slate, should they be required to keep it?
You have the option of, or something.
That'll be a next
Other
question.
than- okay.
Mhm.
Asked to submit the code.
The code is at the top of the screen.
I guess. I think I went to sleep. My phone.
Ew. So the next question is about roofing materials in general for historic or contributing structures. So these are the ones that you traditionally think of as a historic house in the village. On the left, if you keep your cursor on the left, that would be prohibited. In the middle would be optional. So if somebody were to choose that material, great, but it's optional. And then if you moved your slider all the way to the right, that would be, this material should be required on a historic structure.
it still didn't say if if someone's replacing slate. Is to me, if you're replacing slate, then this list is different than just what is allowed on the home.
Yeah, so this would be a structure that, doesn't have a slate roof. Or if you didn't want to, if you wanted to not require slate to be replaced with slate,
Or if you're building new.
or if you're building new, yeah.
That wouldn't be a historical structure.
Oh, yeah, that's
Oh,
a good
you're right.
point, yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Great.
I think on the previous one, I wanted to require slate to be replaced on commercial and municipal buildings, but not on. There was no option to say that.
Yeah, we can go into that further
Yeah.
in discussion, yeah. Cool, looks like we got all responses. This is the same question. This question is for non-historic, non-contributing structures. So think about, anything that was built, in the recent era, even things like maybe 40s or 50s construction. And for the folks that are just joining in, you're welcome to go to menti.com and enter in the code. We're just doing some live surveying. Gauge people's interest or opinions on these topics, and we'll go into open discussion at the end. Exterior windows. Roof replacements from slate are very rare, but window replacements happen far more often and is probably the biggest wild card in historic review, where previously people have been required to use real wood, true divided light windows, even on new construction buildings. And the standard that that's based on is very vague, respect the original character, where more recently the committee's interpretation has been to allow simulated divided light where the muntins are on the exterior side. And that maintains the original character and appearance, but is a lot less expensive, can be more energy efficient when more modern materials are used, because modern all wood windows are not built the same as an 1800s all wood window. The wood is just of different quality today than it was back then. And technology has advanced where fiberclad, even vinyl windows are improving, where a synthetic material can retain that appearance of the historic home. So this question is about those historic or contributing structures, and again, prohibited, optional, or required. How do you feel about these different kinds of windows? If you put something in the other category, when we get to open discussion, we can talk about that.
Emily, is this assuming that this would be, aluminum or vinyl that visually is equivalent to the historic qualities?
Yes,
Okay, so it's not
Yeah.
just any old vinyl.
right. So
Because it's the historic stuff.
yeah, so if you have 6/6 windows, you would replace them with 6/6. 6/6 meaning the number of panes of glass that you would see. And the same question this time for non-historic, non-contributing structures, so more modern build, anything probably from like the fifties and sixties forward. Siding. So today in the zoning bylaws, vinyl is prohibited on historic structures. All other siding materials are vague. And modern materials have come a long way, like fiber cement, brick veneer, and better vinyl, where that original character and appearance can be maintained by the reveal or shape of the siding, its pattern, whether it's vertical or horizontal. And again, that new wood is not as strong and durable as old growth. So properties that, are experiencing water damage on the bottom, where replacing something with a non-wood material would have that durability over time. So the same format question. This time, you're going to agree to strongly agree to disagree. And it's based on looking at siding everywhere, assuming that you would match the style and character of that home. Looking only at giving flexibility to non-contributing, non-historic structures. So regardless of where it's locating at, the flexibility should just be based on its age. Or only give flexibility where the property is invisible or minimally visible from Williston Road.
It's like dial testing, political speech or
Yeah.
something. Wow, It's really gets my blood boiling.
Front yard fences, and then we're getting towards the end too, as well with our survey questions. So currently throughout town and in the village, front yard fences are required to be a lower height, and they must be partially open, like a picket style. Whereas side and rear yard, you could have a taller, fully opaque fence for privacy. So thinking about front yard fences for all properties in the village, what types of materials are you okay with? And which materials are you not okay with? Keeping in mind that this is all properties, historic and non-historic. Cool. Same format question, now thinking about side or rear yard fence materials. So they might be visible from the street, but they might be completely hidden. All right, our last two questions are just for fun. So this or that, thinking about outdoor storage. Not everything in this picture is perfect or what something that would be allowed in the village, but thinking about the outdoor display and storage of things that are for sale. So on the left, we have in Richmond, the Umiak Outfitters, which becomes Ski Express in the winter. And on the right, I'm not sure where this photo is from, but it's more of a hardware store with rakes and other, household sale items on the sidewalk.
So what are the distinguishing features? Why did you pick these two photos? Would you say?
I picked these two photos, one because the items are hung on the wall, and the other because the items are placed along the sidewalk.
So are we supposed to choose one or the other? Or-
Just which one you prefer more.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and it could be for whatever reason you think.
I would have appreciated an indifferent sort of button.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a would you rather,
For both of them, I'd rather see the tree belt in front of the sidewalk.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just focusing on the outdoor storage of sale items. All right, and one more this or that. So the thrift store in Heinsberg that usually has sale racks out on their front entryway. Or this cafe where the bench has mums, is covered in mums and pumpkins.
You can also tell people they can click on the photos and to enlarge.
Oh, Megan said you can click on the photos to enlarge them. They are a bit small.
So is the difference that the first one is under the porch?
Right, yep, it's under the porch. It's not on a seating bench. And now we're just gonna go into open discussion. We're pretty much on schedule. So we have the next 40 minutes for question. And if you have questions for the planning commission, if you have questions for staff about the bylaw revision. If anyone has just comments in general, from the public, if you're in person, just let us know. If you want to speak, if you're on Zoom, you can press the raise hand button. And I'll let you know that you can unmute. You can also use Mentimeter to just type in any of your thoughts or comments on the summary of the amendments that are being proposed, the questions from the Mentimeter. Really, anything you want to type that's not a profanity, go for it.
Can I say just to break the silence here? I answered to a lot of those questions where it was like, one would be allowable, 3 would be not allowed, and 2 would be optional.
Mhm.
And I'll tell you why. It's because it's an affordability sort of mindset that I have approaching these, because whether your house or business is historic or not, it's still a person having to pull off a credit card and pay for windows, pay for siding, or whatever it is. And, like, I think they're gonna generally make the decision they either have to make or a smart decision because they've thought about it carefully, and I think people in the village should be able to choose, you know, the materials they want to choose. Like, for instance, I don't think that a 6x6 window, I mean, that's not important to me at all, you know, just as, you know, there's just a data point of 1 right there, but. And I think somebody buying that window, having to do 6/6 right there, that increases the price a bit, you know, and then you multiply that by 30 windows or however many windows there are in the house. I don't know. I mean, Williston has a real mix of income levels in it. I mean, I look at my road, Maple Road, there's just a whole wide range of incomes on that road alone. I'm sure that's true most neighborhoods around here. And I just think we should be sensitive to the fact that not everyone can afford these things sometimes, you know. Then the other second comment I make is just a general comment, and I kind of I have to admit to not read, like sitting down and actually reading the 50 pages, but I have skimmed this at least a few times. It's just been a particularly busy summer for me, so I apologize but I have like picked up on a few things that's cherry picked, I know, where just to echo Chapin's thought about unintended consequences. Like here's one, just as an example. It has to do with roof pitches. The roof pitch should be like it should stay consistent if you're in an addition, or maybe it should be encouraged to stay consistent or something like that. And I just think about all the examples around the village where that would be, you know, somebody would be non-conforming, you know, like my house, when I did my addition would be non-conforming. And we made that slope decision, frankly, to make the back of our house look better. I think it does look better. That's my opinion. I'm sure somebody disagrees, but it's like, whatever, it's my house. I should be able to put the roof pitch on that I want, so long as it can carry the snow and it's, you know, I mean, whatever. I'd be okay with the town saying, you know, Andy, your 312 roof pitch is not going to carry the snow, and that'd be fine. I've got, all right, I'll get 512, but whatever those numbers might be flipped around. So it's the unintended consequences to some of these like little nitpicky. I look at them as a little nitpicky, like the roof pitch should stay consistent, and there are a few other things I picked up. I don't want to take up too much time here, but the unintended consequences, I think, is maybe a little bit of a theme that I see where maybe this could be simplified a little bit to the essentials. You know, I know that's a broad thing, and I know you're kind of deep in at this point, and that's maybe not too helpful. And I know that, you know, but okay, but let's just point out the roof pitch one. There you go. There's an example. So those are a couple basics, couple sort of general thoughts. Okay, another unintended consequence. The driveways having to go on the side.
Right, yeah. I read
It's
that.
like maybe your lot really doesn't allow for that. Maybe you don't want your driveway that close to your neighbor's house for consideration of your neighbor, right? I don't know. Again, I think of a ton of non-conforming cases. The Rostad house, which has now been bought. I mean, they put their driveway front and center. They did an awesome job on that house. That house is rocking, you know, and that would be kind of non-conforming, I think, in this scenario where you want to put the driveways off to the side. But their house is awesome, you know. And last comment, and then I'll shut up. It's the this or that. I really appreciate all the work you guys have done. You sat down with me for, you know, an hour. You guys are awesome, really, truly. Not a fan of those questions, you know, because I think it sort of leads people down a conformist path. And who cares whether the kayaks are stacked against the wall or put on the ground, whatever. They're selling kayaks, you know. I walked around Minneapolis this summer and just like was in awe of all the architectural variety and diversity in that city. And I think it's because people are just able to have a little more freedom, have a little more fun in their architectural decision making. And I think when you start driving people down this path of like, ooh, should we do it this way or that way? It's just a little too conformist for my taste. I think of Dorset, Vermont. You have to have a White House if you're in the middle of town. I mean, that is crazy. Nothing against White Houses, they're fine, but just like every house, come on. You know, so I wonder sometimes why Williston has a little bit of a uniformity sort of thing going. And I think people should be left free to sort of make some decisions on their own, and we'll be just fine. Okay.
Well, thank you,
Yeah.
Andy.
No problem.
On Zoom, we have Shayla and then Matt.
Hi, everybody. Thanks again for putting it together this way. I did just want to ask, I think I just want to make sure in the questions when I was answering, like, I do really think it would be wonderful to have for businesses, especially those that people could frequent, so you could walk down and go to a cafe or go to a shop. And just wanting to think about, I'm just thinking about the zoning discussions we've had about like when the hours of operation and when deliveries can happen, and just wanting to make sure that we don't get into a scenario where, if you did have a cafe, which I would love, that, baked goods are delivered at 4 a.m. or something like that. So just really wanting to protect, both make it a lot easier for people to do that type of thing and also make sure we're protecting folks living there. So I'm sure you're striking that balance, but I just want to reinforce that desire.
Matt, looks like your hand is raised.
Yeah, sorry, I was waiting for her to finish. I'm a little late, obviously, to the meeting, but I did take part in the walking tour. So I did get to see all of that. And I think got to see a wide variety of opinions regarding all of these matters. And I think a lot of us can agree that live there, that we do agree that there's it's quite strict currently what you can do with the homes, be it siding, windows, roofing, etc. I think a good balance is definitely would be useful. I think specifically for roofing, I would like to be able to see the ability to have all metal roofing, not just standing seam metal roofing personally. It's my experience. We own multiple rental properties and have seen standard corrugated roofs last over 50 or 60 years. So they're cost effective and they obviously last a long time. Generally don't leak if they're installed correctly. But more importantly, I was kind of joining this discussion in order to kind of speak a little bit about density standards. I was surprised during the walking tour to find out from Emily that in the 80s, the density standards were potentially, I think, like 2 or 3 times what they are now. I would be of the opinion that we should allow, slightly higher density standards. Maybe what we had in the 80s was not correct, but many towns and villages are addressing the lack of housing with higher density. We already have the infrastructure in place in the village. I think, for example, on my property on 7997 Williston Road, which is featured on the walking tour, my wife and I own Ridgeline Real Estate Company. We have a large garage out back, which is practically useless, but if it was fully renovated, could be easily another, 3-bedroom, 2-bath home, while still maintaining the essentially the appearance that it has now, but we are currently limited by density standards. So anyways, that's kind of just kind of my thought process here, and would hope that we can kind of keep that discussion moving forward down the line, along with all of these other zoning bylaws regarding, siding and roofing and different materials. So that's about it. Thanks.
Is Emily Morton still on the hack?
She is, yes.
But I don't see her here tonight. I've lived in the village since 1985 and gone through repeated renovations that were reviewed by the hack. Most recently, actually replacing some slate with slate. But it also includes, in the past, getting permission to use vinyl clad wood on the 2nd story back of the house windows, which solved the problem I had with repeated replacement. And so I come from that experience, and I just feel as though what we're trying to achieve with the village, a lot of it is the aesthetic. It's sort of the the spacing of the houses, the amount of setback, the pitch of the roofs being somewhat compatible, not identical. Some have ridges going perpendicular, some parallel, etc. So to me, there should be a lot of, we shouldn't be extremely restrictive, but we should say, here's the things that matter. We don't want one house up close to the street, the next one back, that kind of thing. And so when it comes to most of the questions we just had, I feel like any material that aesthetically looks like the original material, if it's less expensive or lasts longer or is more effective, like better insulating, then I feel that we should encourage it. I also feel there's special cases of divided light and slate where there's a significantly different cost. And I feel like the way we should deal with that is we should provide some financial assistance for somebody who wants to use the on a historic structure, use the historically accurate material. But we shouldn't say you can't use anything as long as aesthetically it's compatible. And I frankly am okay with somebody replacing a slate roof with a standing seam metal roof. But I'm also, I could be convinced, that's why I asked about Emily too, because I feel like she's got the strongest background of any of us in the reasons for being historic. And on the windows, I put the comment about allowing wiggle room. My house was built probably around 1815, and it must have had 6/6 windows, but I never have seen any. Those windows were replaced with 2/2 throughout the house sometime in the 1800s. And then when the turret was added in the Queen Anne period, they put 1/1s in the turret. So when I bought the house in the 1980s, it had 2/2s and 1/1s, all of which had been installed prior to 1900. And so I have a hard time saying that if I go replace a window, it should be a 6/6, because that's what it was when the house was originally built. And I feel like that kind of nuance is needed throughout. And so to me, we should show that we want to be, say, historically informed, like know what maybe was there and how we might want to adapt, as well as being, that's on historic structures, contributing historic structures. And on other structures, we just want to be compatible with the environment around and not have a jarring difference. But we should allow individuality. So even though I have been fine adhering to what the hack has required of me over many years, I'm for just looking at the aesthetic and not looking at the specifics as strongly. Certainly not the materials.
I agree with you. I own the old house on Maple, and we've lived there about 15 years. There's some, we're not going to rip down the old wood siding and replace it with vinyl, but there are a lot of areas on it. We've replaced the wood several times, and it just keeps rotting, and there's no way around it. We need to use something that's not going to rot out immediately, so being able to use something on the baseboard of the house, or, a couple columns that the roofs aren't right and hit the rain, that they won't rot out continually. So I'd really appreciate having the flexibility to put something more long lasting on the house.
I do want to read into the record. Someone sent me a message. I agree on the windows. If the look and feel is important, then perhaps the town can approve a style. But $50,000 or more replacement for a single family home's windows is not an equitable solution for everyone.
And that comes back to me on if somebody's historically informed and it is a historic structure and they want to have modern windows, but with an exterior munion, so it looks compatible with whatever was there before, I don't have a problem with that. Even though I've put true divided light windows in many times, but I've experienced the problems with that. The different ways to then try to have a storm window, done it 3 different ways. I've removed all the old original the aluminum storms that were on my house when I bought it, of course. And then I had custom made wooden exterior storms for some windows, and then some of the new ones, we did true divided light, and then we had these storms that were sort of pinned just to the sash. They didn't cover the whole opening, they just covered the sash, and those have their own issues. So I haven't found anything that's really great, and I feel like people should be able to experiment and find something that works for them, as long as the look isn't. When people put aluminum storms on these old houses, that changed the look a lot. And, but let's be flexible. I can't believe I'm saying that. I'm really historically, I value the history a huge amount. I just want it to be a balance. The other way to put it is, we're not a museum. We want to maintain a recognition of our past, but not try to reproduce it.
Emily, there's a comment in there about feedback from many other people throughout this process. Do you have a sense of, it says keep their voices in throughout the discourse? And I'm wondering if you have a sense of, if we had done these preference sliding scale surveys with everyone you've heard from and talked to, do you think you would see as much of a kind of tendency toward flexibility and keeping things somewhat optional as we've seen tonight? Or do you think there are views that are truly not represented there?
That's a good question. I think the views that we heard tonight are in line with what I've reviewed in the survey. So to date, we have 100 responses. I'm sharing the 94 responses. I can't access my other version of this document. But people most highly voted value the historic or architectural aesthetic as an important character and consider energy efficiency and longevity. In general, people tended to disagree with being very strict about requiring slate to be retained on existing homes and requiring there to be, stricter material standards. So I think the survey comments that are tonight are reflective of the survey comments that we've received since the beginning of July and the meetings that Matt and I have had with people.
It might be interesting to ask a question like, considering that a slate roof replacement would cost X and an asphalt roof replacement would cost Y. Now, knowing those figures, what do you think about slate replacement requirements? Because I think that would sort of drive it home for people a little bit more, because then you can put yourself in their shoes and say, geez, I don't know if I could spend, I don't even know what a slate roof would cost to replace. Yeah, so I might be thinking about selling my house if I had to spend $60,000 to do like a new roof, It's a huge,
interesting
huge expense.
point, Andy, is that that slate roof will probably last 125 years or more. And so if you were to amortize it, you might actually.
No, I understand that, but sometimes it's a cash flow issue.
Exactly.
You just, again, I go back to the unintended consequences where you just don't know people's situations and like, maybe they can't get a loan for 60,000, and even though it might be the financially long-term prudent thing to do, maybe they have 5 years to live. I don't know. There's a million things that could go into a decision like that.
And I think also, it's not even for the present homeowner. Like if you had a slate roof on a owner occupied home, like I was to buy a house, I would be very hesitant to buy a house with a slate roof unless it had been put on like within the past 5 years, And I won't live long enough to care. But it's that becomes another dimension of that sort of
financial question where it's not just about your own house and what you're choosing to do, but also kind of how kind of marketable it might be, or how it's perceived. And I think, I guess with the slate thing, we only in some ways, the only building I really want Slate to stay on is Slate Barn on Slate Barn Drive. But that, maybe there could be a town GoFundMe to keep the slate on that. And like the other ones, like I understand, yes, sure, it's a nice historical textural detail. It's very beautiful when it's well maintained. But I also agree that we don't live in a museum. I was over the weekend in Western Massachusetts and going through towns that were, the little markers on the side of the building are like 1778, 1804, these kind of things. And it's like, but guess what? They have modern windows in many of them. It's just not as precious a thing. And I take these concerns about the wood rot. My house was built in 1996 and it's got rotten column bases that we've had to deal with. And so, yes, it's an ongoing issue and it can be solved, and it won't really negatively affect the aesthetics or the sort of appeal of the place. And also, like, rotting houses are not aesthetically pleasing. Falling down, unpainted, roof caving in because it's slate and the main post has collapsed. Those kinds of things are definitely not aesthetically pleasing.
It might be worth just asking if anybody objects to sort of this direction, because it does seem to be the consensus of people who've spoken and of the surveying we've done that we should relax the material standards and have it be more an aesthetic. Keep it just to the aesthetics, not to the actual material.
Can I just propose, sorry, I know I'm talking a lot. Can I just propose just like a slightly different framing to this conversation? It's a useful one. I mean, even though there are only so many number of slate roofs. But just, to me, it's like, okay, the property owner should by default be making these decisions unless there's something compelling, that should change that. And so it seems to me like the historical consideration is the thing that is maybe outweighing the property owner. If I'm reading that wrong, let me know. But again, we don't live in a museum, and that's kind of where I fall on this issue. Like, I just think we live in Williston. It's a nice town. We all love our town, and I love living here. But yeah, like, we're just regular people living in Williston. I don't think it's not a museum, and that's kind of how I basically think about it. That it's not compelling enough for the town to have this say in property, in particular, if we're talking about materials here. I just don't find it compelling enough to say the town should be making these sort of like, you got to do it this way. I think the property owner should have the say. That's why we buy these things, pay taxes. We have property rights, and that's kind of, I don't know. That's just guiding principle how I frame this issue. Not that I don't. I mean, I love the character. I do. So it's not like I'm indifferent to it. I'm totally not. And I feel like I'm like Chapin, kind of going a little bit back and forth here. But so yeah, I guess I'm with Chapin unless there's a balance. But I'd probably be a little bit more on the property owner side, making the calls.
I think it's worth remembering that some of the fears that spawned historic preservation in the village were that, say, 3 historic homes in a row would be bulldozed and replaced with a Red Lobster or an outlet mall, in the case of what was modeled at the Slate Barn. And those were not unreal fears in the mid-1980s. Vermont didn't have the controls on strip development that it has now. Williston didn't have some of the land use controls it has now. And somehow that desire to save the village from becoming a Red Lobster or an outlet mall, the tool that was identified was historic preservation. It's a fairly powerful tool to prevent that sort of thing, but it prevents a lot of other things too. And then I think my perception from administering these rules over nearly the last 15 years is that over time that evolved into greater and greater degrees of detail and control. Because, well, didn't we make the last guy do all wood windows? Oh gosh, we did. We better do that again. And the other part of this is once you start talking about historic preservation, or if you go to a historic preservation conference, as I have and Emily has, you're going to meet the purists. You're going to meet the person who says you should spend 30 to 40 hours per window removing it, steaming the lead paint off with full protective gear and reglazing it and lovingly replacing it and putting a glass storm over it and removing it every single year. Just that's what must be done. And we'll meet people who absolutely are going to tell you that your historic district is worthless unless you're doing that stuff. And it's very easy to just get more restrictive, right? Because when you're less restrictive, you're losing something, and once it's gone, and that's the fear. And that was really some of the roots of this whole process, was to go back out and kind of inquire to the town and the village of, boy, it feels like a lot of friction when we go to administer these rules. Is this what you, the town of Williston, really intended, or is this kind of a snowball that has happened over the years out of that very legitimate fear initially of total loss of the character of the village? And so here we are.
So the Historic and Architecture Advisory Committee could do it. I really like the term historically informed. It's a term we use in doing early music. We do historically informed performances. It's not an exact reproduction instrument, or you're not doing exactly the style. You may not even know what the style was that particular time in that particular country where that was first performed. But you study what you can, and you are then informed in what you decide to do. And to me, we're going to have this process of getting a certificate. And along with that certificate, wouldn't it be great if the hat gives the person who asked the history of their house, which we have for many of them, all the ones that are historically identified, and some of the information about it, so that that person was then deciding what to do with that historical information.
It's interesting. More of an educational sort of entity.
So that somebody could take pride. If they decided they wanted to replace slate with slate and there was a grant available to, they could take pride in doing that if that's what they wanted to do.
It's cool idea, Jacob.
We also talked about the non-materials questions or some of the location-based ones. I don't remember what they were.
Yeah, location of commercial uses,
Right.
Williston Road, side streets, everywhere.
Do you have the text of those first questions, Andy, or is that too hard to get to them?
Now I can get to that.
I have a friend who used to be a flute maker, which he did in his garage. So he would have been a homeowner on site, but he had to use some chemicals that would have been considered hazardous to treat the metals that he was working with. And so I saw there that then now would be out. Well, I just feel like we could find exceptions to what we're saying.
Yeah. Yeah, like I was thinking about like a cabinet maker, for instance, very like kind of fine carpentry. A lot of times that requires, it's way better to cut wood outside than it is, and sawdust is not a big deal outside, but it is a huge deal inside. And so, and a lot of people will bring the chop saw or whatever it is outside and use it and then, put it back again. And between noise and dust, like, would that be prohibited? That just seems a little restrictive. Given that we also say that we want to support the local economy and small business owners and, you know, those other kinds of, town stated goals. You know, that's just one scenario I'm thinking of. I can certainly also think of plenty of things that I, you know, wouldn't really want my neighbors to start, so don't get any ideas. You know, like, and I think these probably wouldn't be feasible anyway, but I remember a few years ago when there were some very legitimate concerns about auto body refinishing down on South Brownell. And some paint fumes and things like that. So, you know, absolutely, there are things that should, you know, shouldn't be routine and all day long happening, you know, right next to a residential, fully residential use. But I wonder that sort of balance of supporting small businesses, especially kind of craft oriented or, you know, solo practitioner type things. Where a little more flexibility would allow a lot more sort of business feasibility.
Yeah, I think so long as there's quiet enjoyment, is that the phrase, quiet enjoyment? You know, I mean, I have these in my leases where it's like, okay, I underline it, like, make sure everyone's like, you know, you're not screwing up with your neighbors. I mean, to me, like, that would be the standard, as long as you could have quiet enjoyment of your home. I wouldn't have any problem with any, you know, quiet enjoyment would mean no fumes wafting over through my windows, you know,
Right.
and no noise, like huge, like large, like really noisy stuff happening. You know, off hours or otherwise, I guess. That would be my standard for that.
Yeah, I think chapter 18 of the current bylaw, where it has noise thresholds in development review. That it would sound like a conversation at the property line. I think it's like 55 or 60 decibel levels. But if that table saw just sounds like the level of a normal conversation at the property line would be that threshold. And louder than that isn't allowed in chapter 18.
Yeah, I'll give a couple of examples. Not in the village, we had a unpermitted cabinet making business in a garage in a residential subdivision. We did get complaints about it, had to do with the fumes from the finishing paints. And I don't recall the exact resolution, but I know we reached out to the owner and said, we've had a complaint. The complaint is specifically about when you're finishing stuff.
Yeah.
Which, you know, maybe the whole rest of that business could have been conducted just fine, maybe even switching to a low VOC product.
Or increasing ventilation.
Or-
which would have been better
Yeah,
anyway. Yeah.
doing that stuff, yeah, I mean,
Right.
it was clearly pretty strong.
Yeah.
The other one we had was someone who sought a home business permit in the village for a home machine shop. And there was just no way my predecessor could be convinced that that would operate within those noise limits in chapter 18 of the noise ordinance. Just said, he's like, I just don't see it. I don't see how you're gonna be able to operate, you know, metal lathes and other things like that.
And the outside storage thing reminds me of the guy on Old Stage Road. It was just outside the village, but that he was storing things for his business in his yard, and it got.
Yeah, on the one hand, it's really easy to have an absolute prohibition on outdoor storage related to a business. On the other hand, it really precludes a lot of things. You know, a fine woodworker could have slab wood under a tarp, you know, that they haven't milled down yet. I mean, that's really not uncommon. Or, you know, a piece of something. So where's the line? I mean, I think there's some of this where we can just literally fall back to those chapter 18 limits and say, if the burden of proof is going to be on you, the applicant, that, you know, if your business characteristically has things that might run afoul of nuisance, can you explain to us how you won't? And then, of course, some of this also leans on the town, if it's going to have more nuanced rules, having more nuanced capability for enforcement, which is always the challenge.
The minimally visible and invisible from the street can cover a lot of that. If someone has a stack of wood
Out back.
that behind that you can't see from the street, it might bother their side neighbor, but their side neighbor could be growing a hedge or putting a fence if they don't want to see what you've got.
Just so I can put my data point in there. I think we should be promoting business, like small businesses. And I think this is a way to do it. This is how a lot of businesses start. They start in their garage, quite literally. And, it happened. There's endless stories of this happening. And I think we should encourage it,
Well, and in the village, what we see is there's a lot of this potential for partial conversion to even so far as a retail business, if it's got the street frontage out of what was the front kitchen or behind the front porch. And there's a lot that can happen in a pretty small space that can really, again, meet those village master plan goals of vibrancy and give somebody another income in the property or access to tax credits they wouldn't have otherwise. Now there's something commercial happening in the site. So I think that's what a lot of this project has been about. This is specific, I don't know, Emily, correct me if I'm wrong, to home business.
Right.
And I think where we're kind of going is, we have first off, broad context, Vermont state law says municipalities shall not prohibit the reasonable operation of a home business in a single family home. So you have to have provisions in your bylaws that allow them. There's some guardrails around that. What we're talking about here is the village a place where there's a greater home business, either in size or intensity or type, that makes sense given the mixed use nature of the village. So it's not a full conversion of a property to commercial. It's not site VRB necessarily, but there's just more stuff you can do as a homeowner in the village because you're in the village.
Matt, is there, we're talking about all these possible scenarios for small or even home businesses. Is there, I seem to remember a few years ago that there was not, but is there now essentially a sort of business listing or kind of a permit process for, say, what's the threshold for having to seek town permission for what you might be running out of your home, or how you're, thinking about maybe reusing part of your home for something? Like, where is that threshold?
So essentially what the zoning bylaw says is any non-residential activity for profit or otherwise that's happening out of the home is a home business. There's, I think, some language that sets a lower limit, says like a true, like just your home office doesn't count. And obviously we've now gone into a world of remote work that didn't exist when this was drafted. The practical application is if someone comes in and says, do I need a home business permit? We'll look at some of the thresholds in our bylaw. Are people coming to your home business? Are you building a dedicated space in which you're going to do something? What is that thing? We've had a few instances where we had somebody who was a firearms dealer. And actually what he did at his home business was paperwork. Brokered the sale of firearms from some wholesaler to people in law enforcement. But the federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms said he had to have whatever municipal permit he could get. And we said, well, you're to us, in zoning, you're an accountant. We don't care, but if you apply, we'll give you a permit. So we do occasionally get those, but the traditional ones, the in-home music teacher. We have special rules for family child care homes that are actually, a little more expensive. But we have all over Williston, single chair hair salon in a 500 square foot garage, or a 2-chair hair and nail salon. Various kinds of shops and home industries, especially out in the ag world. We do have a cabinet maker, at least one I'm aware of. It can really.
And then a lot of professional services.
Yeah, all kinds of those things. A lot of people who are just a remote worker, or they're a freelancer with a home office, we never see them, and I would be really hard pressed to tell somebody like that they had to get a home business permit.
So so ultimately, we don't actually have much of a sense then of how common or numerous such businesses might be currently.
Not totally. I mean, we could we could look at what we permitted, but I'm guessing that's a fraction of what's out there.
I know we've rebuffed businesses from the village when they, and well, I don't think what you want to do would comply as a home business. And the uses that are allowed in this district are so stringent that you can't go to the development review board either. So there have been some of those, but when a property is for sale, oh, could I do this or that out of the garage or, you know, out of part of my home?
You brought up how a coffee shop somehow is not, sorry, is somehow different from a restaurant. Well, can you expand on that? Because I was a little confused by
Right,
what's
so
that meant.
the current list of allowed uses is based on NAICS code, which is an industry standard code. And only the code for full service restaurant is allowed, and that's defined as where you sit down and a waiter takes your order and brings your food. And that's not how most people dine out these days. It's either a counter service or a coffee shop. So those types of things people would want to see aren't allowed. A bakery could be a whole number of things. It could be a industrial factory, or it can be, you know, like Red Hen in Middlesex, where it's a much smaller artisan scale. They're probably now even kind of above the artisan and the, you know,
They're
Yeah.
factory.
they have a factory now, yeah, but that use code can mean the same thing, can be the same code for a lot of different things on the spectrum. But the smaller things are okay with the village. Home business that maybe brews a couple kegs of beer is a lot different than Frost in Heinsberg.
We think, but aren't sure, that the origination of the full service restaurant only was the no McDonald's provision. We're afraid that fast food is going to show up in the village.
So there's an unintended consequence, right?
Well, right, so you make a decision based on a set of use categories, and it makes sense in that context, but, you know, I mean, the restaurant that was in the village when I got here, you went to the counter and told them what you wanted, and then they called your name and you went up and got it. So it was, either illegal under the 2009 bylaw, it might have even been illegal under the pre-2009.
It existed before.
You know, but somebody looked at it under the old zoning ordinance and said, I guess this is okay, or just said, it would be crazy to say no to this. It
Right,
seems like just what the village wants.
that would probably make sense because the community coffee shop was established in the 90s, and that was before the current version of the bylaw. But then it went away probably right around the time that the bylaw was being written.
So, what is the worst that can happen if we are regulating parking and noise and size of square footage of buildings, et cetera, et cetera? What do we need, if we don't want to say what type of business, and we don't want to be as restrictive, what do we have to worry about that we are not regulating in this?
Yeah, I would love a list of thoughtful, effective, like principles that we adhere to. And not so in the weedy type things, you know. Like the noise restriction, to me, that's a thoughtful restriction, you know. Percentage of dwelling that can be used for commercial purposes, that would be a thoughtful sort of principle or guideline. I would personally like to see it up from 25%, maybe 50 or 33 at least, you know.
Well, I think in many cases, certainly along Williston Road, it's okay if it's not owner occupied. So, you know, to me, the home business thing is one thing. But are we saying you can't have somebody buy a building and put a real estate office in it and not live there? You know, where are we with the commerce other than that, other than the home business?
Yeah, we're pretty flexible because we're going to that list of outright prohibited uses like mini storage, car dealership, a couple of those heavier industrial type things, and then components of prohibited uses. So overhead garages, overhead doors more than a 2-bay residential garage. So you're not getting a loading dock. You can't have very large outdoor storage areas. There's a limit on the commercial footprint. So limiting those nuisance elements.
So it almost feels to me like we've got it covered. Of course, then somebody will come in with something that nobody likes, but
It's just to add to the conversation, I think that we've heard a lot of perspectives and a lot of points of views, and sometimes they conflict with each other. And I think in my mind, I had to have a guidepost, right? Why did we do this? Why are we doing this now? And what's the history behind it? And I had to go back to the purpose of the village zoning district. Because to me, in my mind, that's my guidepost. Because then if that is at fault, then everything else will follow for no reason. There's no purpose. Just like, you know, any institution would have mission and vision, and you always got to have a mission and vision because it's like aspire to become. And so I had to fold, you know, this page right here with what is the purpose of the village zoning district? Because to me, if this is in fact the purpose, then everything that follows it should be consistent with the purpose. May it be aesthetic, functionality, property rights, ownership, et cetera, they will have to conform with the purpose. Because that's what set everything off. Otherwise, we're gonna have to go back to the very starting point, which is quite impossible at this. It's gonna, you know, the time and effort that went into this.
do you like what this purpose says?
I don't think it doesn't necessarily matter what I think of it. I think it's very ideal, I think. But as a regular, ordinary Williston citizen, I'm guided by this. Otherwise, you know, there could be thousands of directions where we could go. I like the idea of having, you know, it's entitled guidelines too. The title says it's guidelines. So it's, and I don't know how you interpret guidelines. Because in my world, we interpret guidelines as, you know, sort of things that you have to consider and do when you're doing something, but you're not, you know, it's not the law. That's my perhaps naive perspective on this.
Great comment. Thank you, Ruben. So it is 8:40. The planning commission does have a little bit of other business on their agenda. All these Mentimeter responses will be posted as part of the minutes, and the Zoom recording will be posted online. There's one question on here that I do want to touch on. Can this matter be a referendum for the town to vote on? So where we're at in process is we're working on an internal draft that will be published and made available before the planning commission warns a public hearing. Again, that'll be a meeting that people can attend in person or on Zoom. And if the planning commission votes on it, it would go to the select board for final adoption. There would not be a townwide vote on this unless a select board decision were to be appealed. But the planning commission and select board would vote before it becomes adopted. And the version that we have out on the table tonight, there are, you know, the significant changes that we're working on, and hopefully try to rectify as best we can the conflicting opinions. We're here to find, you know, the middle ground that the planning commission can agree on.
So the one that you have published a month or two ago was V1, and this is V2?
The one I published is V2 in May.
Oh,
And there'll
V2
be-
is May.
This is being marked up to high heavens, and we'll
Okay.
work on a revised version of this, so it'll be 2.1 or whatever, and have the updated date. And that would be what the planning commission would warn a hearing on. It would be an updated version of this.
I just want to say too, that the survey that's been online that has real pictures and examples that hundreds of people have done, right?
Yeah, so far 100 responses.
Okay. To me, that is like a referendum, you know, if it's nuanced referendum. So getting the maximum engagement, people may have seen, I put something in Front Porch Forum yesterday, just, I feel like You've done a great job getting a lot of engagement, and if we get maximum engagement, then that's our public input.
Yeah, so what can you speak, I know we're going late a little bit, but what can you speak to that analysis and synthesizing of data that or other viewpoints that are coming in and how that translates into revisions?
Well, those 8 points are
Yeah.
ones that we've had different opinions about, so,
Yeah.
you know, that this is it.
I know, but I'm wondering, like, when you who puts pen to paper and like, I mean, so what are you considering and like, what's your process there, you know?
Lots of conversations with Matt and like writing something down and be like, no, that's crap, write it again.
Yeah, But it's basically you two hammering this out.
Yeah, and
You're a consultant, right?
yeah, Michael Allen, so I'm creating that running list so I can give Michael one thing. This is an InDesign document and say, make all of these changes from small grammatical to swapping pictures to these overarching issues. So Matt and I, based on what we hear from the planning commission and you guys, will come up with some revised edits. And then Michael would finalize them in this document. And at the end of the day, we would become, the owners of this document and the images and graphics in it. And if we need to make a revision, amend it further down the road, we can do that.
Well, I applaud you for this. It's a pretty big effort, so thank you.
To speak to your question, though, we have those conversations. We write a draft. We run it by the planning commission. Is this what you heard? Is this what you meant? Does what we wrote reflect what you saw on the spectrum here? Does it still make sense within the whole thing? So we give it our best shot, but it's still public process.
Somebody's got to write this stuff.
Yeah. And our intent with this process is to do as much iterative work before a public hearing. So statute pretty much only requires us to give this document 15 days. The planning commission has a meeting, they make a few changes, done. And we're trying to be a lot more comprehensive with our public outreach and our participation. So it doesn't feel like a done deal, and that the public has input on the iterations before the planning commission votes.
Much appreciated.
It makes it worthwhile when people like you three show up.
Yes. And people online.
Yes.
Cool, thank you guys.
Thank you very much. That was fun.
All right, so we have discussion of the. No, we're doing that at the end. Holding off on that.
Ruben, you should take a copy of the village master plan if you don't already have one.
Sure, yeah, I'll do that.
That kind of goes into some like vision purpose stuff that I think you would enjoy.
Thank you.
So we're gonna have a quick discussion on form-based code. Is that a little some updates for us and how's that select board meeting go?
So I haven't had a chance to really speak with the commission about where we're at with form-based code. I'll start with the bare bones of process, and then we can talk a little bit about what under consideration. The select board did vote to direct staff to make what we judge to be substantive changes to the code, and I'll go over those in a minute. And therefore warn a new public hearing on that altered draft. So that's what state law requires. If the select board makes substantive changes, they need to communicate that to the planning commission, generally by me. The planning commission submits a revised bylaw report, which is the document you have on your screen. And then the select board holds their hearing.
I was confused by this report because I didn't see any changes in it.
There are none.
It was all the reasons why we shouldn't make the changes they asked for.
Well, so let me address that. I added some language to the beginning of this, simply stating that the select board has made substantive changes and is therefore holding a new hearing.
Oh, I see.
But that as far as addressing the goal of the town plan, as the bylaw report asks you to identify it, the updated draft is still doing those things. I believe it is the planning commission as a whole's opinion that it's not doing those things as well or as geographically comprehensively as it was in the transmittal draft. But I really went through the report and didn't find a lot that I wanted to change.
Right, and there were three things that they changed, right?
Correct.
And I don't think, I'd be interested to know, but I don't think there's a lot of disagreement with the building height, the way they did it. They didn't change the stories, they made a maximum height. It was obviously there was a lot of community input on that too. It wasn't just the developer saying, hey, we want buildings this high. It felt like a continuation of the process we were doing. And so I'm just speaking for myself now, but I'm guessing that we are okay with that one. So it really is just the two boundary changes that we have a problem with. So to me, they undermine everything in here. Like all the things we're trying to do with form-based code, we're saying, oh, but you can't do it in this area. Oh, but you can't do it in this area. So it just, I can't say this is a report that's accurate with the changes.
Okay. So. Your duty as planning commission members is to provide the select board with an updated bylaw report. You can certainly also submit a memo of comment to the select board in advance of their hearing.
But this is the memo in that this doesn't have the change of language or the change of the map. This doesn't have the maps or the change. This doesn't have the itemized changes they're asking for.
No, this is the bylaw report required by state law.
Okay.
So this is a report that we make to the state that says we're changing our zoning bylaw. Here's what's happening.
Oh, okay.
Here's why it's supported by our town plan. It's not saying it's the perfect thing that's supported by our town plan. It's saying it's not against
Okay.
our town plan.
Yeah. But to me, it partly is. We were doing things that were implementing our town plan, and they said, wait, let's pull it back on these areas. And so. And I don't want to be the only one saying this. That's just how I feel.
Can we just have Matt report back to all of us about what that select board hearing, what we would take away from that meeting? I wasn't able to go.
Sure.
Last week?
2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago.
So I'll start with building height as the least
Right,
controversial.
we couldn't go because we had our meeting.
And I watched it.
So, I think as you did, the select board experienced a lot of public comment about building height and allowing buildings that are substantially taller than what's allowed in tap corners today. And really the conversation focused on a theoretical maximum building height that would result from putting the steepest roof, possible roof on the largest possible building. Something that is probably pretty unlikely to happen anyway, because the building just becomes unwieldy at that point in terms of having livable space inside of it and some other things.
Nobody said it, but somehow we have one of those buildings right ahead of Church Street.
Right, it's a very steep roof.
I mean, it's
Yeah.
100 years old, but it was built in a very steep roof that goes up many stories.
Yeah, it's almost the height of the building itself. So, the comment was from the public in general, we don't like the idea of buildings in excess of 100 feet tall in tap corners, which was possible with the pitched roof on the big building. We went back and worked with our consultant, looking at a 5-story building with a single attic story inside of a pitched roof, and a more reasonable building size, particularly building depth, and came up with the 87-foot limit, which is kind of a funny number, but it's the height at which you can build the middle allowed roof pitch on top of a 5-story building that is 65 feet deep, which is a much more typical depth than the maximum 80-foot depth the code allows. So it's a sort of a safety catch. My opinion, and I expressed this to select board, is I think it would be very rare that 87-foot height limit is what actually ends up limiting height on any particular building or site. It's like when we talk about developing in the village and we say, well, you can build this, but you've got to have parking and you've got to have open area and you've got to meet your setbacks, et cetera, et cetera. The same kinds of forces are imposed on site development in the form-based code area. And I've struggled to model a site yet where I didn't run out of height because I ran out of parking. I gotta be honest, I'm still needing enough parking that unless I build 2 layers of parking underneath the building, which has not proven economical in Williston yet. I have to knock a story off the building because I can't park it. Or I have to build something like 3,000 square foot apartments, which is not realistic either. So that was building height. The story limits stay in place. There's an outer limit there just to prevent that sort of worst case scenario. And life goes on. The 2 boundary changes are worth discussing individually. The first is related to removing that northeast portion of the code area, primarily the lands where Chris Snyder has the annex mixed-use project proposed. And that was a request that Mr. Snyder made. And as some of you probably know, that project is in process and did meet a deadline to be vested in the current bylaws. That vesting pertained to the entire development layout, including, streets, open spaces, et cetera, and about 75% of the dwelling units in it. So there was a fairly vigorous conversation at the select board. How would it play out for the remaining phase of the project to be regulated under form-based code when sort of everything else had been set in place? So, you're not moving those buildings around on the site at that point. You're probably imposing some design standards. And the select board made a decision and said, take it out, based on that request.
And they seem to, in their, what they said, say, oh, it's 75% vested, only 25% go. And it's not likely, I think Jeff said, oh, the only time that would kick in then is mostly if it failed and another project. That's very unlikely because this project is likely to succeed. But they sort of said, 75% in, we'll take it. Forgetting that if it got redone halfway through because the environment changed or Snyder changed in some way, if it had to get redone, it would have to be redone with form-based code to meet form-based code, any part that was redone. And when at the very same meeting, at the very next meeting, which is when they discussed building heights, he was there asking for an exemption on street width for a road. And the select board has put them out that, that would be an opportunity to say, well, if the street designs agreed with the form-based code, we would consider allowing a 50-foot right-of-way on the street. It just felt like if you look at the history of the Finney Crossing projects, there have been so many changes along the way. And we lost things that we thought we had at the beginning. And so I have a hard time saying 75% in and nothing's going to change, and so give it to him. I feel like he needs to be looking in his rearview mirror and making sure everything he does isn't going to put him in a bad spot if he has to redo it. And that they'll make him conform at least somewhat, even with the 75%. That's where I'm at. So I just felt like they did not consider the effect that it would have to say, other than if it had to be redeveloped completely. And I thought they actually said that in their comments. They said, oh, 75%, so we shouldn't fuss with the 25%. And I think they just totally missed the point of how it might affect the 75% if he knew that he would have to comply if he changed anything.
Yeah, I would say that there wasn't a lot of room for a discussion of strategy as you just sort of laid out in that select board conversation. Maybe even not really my place as staff to ask them to engage in all of that, but rather to just try to give them that picture of, well, you'd be leaving this in the Taft Corner zoning district. It has a set of standards it would need to continue to follow. That's where it's at.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, that's fine. So, the other one was related to JL Davis Realty in the Taft Corners Park area. We had a boundary going out and encompassing.
Shayla might have a question then.
Oh, go ahead, Shayla. I can see your hand.
No, that's fine. And it kind of relates to both of them. Right now, after the planning commit or after the select board send it back to the planning commission, is it no longer law?
No.
Where are we?
It's law, until November, I think, 13th. Or if the form-based code is adopted, then everything gets set to whatever that draft says.
Okay. And then I guess my thought is, if we have, obviously we'll have another hearing. And we have another hearing, if again, we receive the feedback, which we already received. That those, and the town has already made clear that besides those two developers, everyone else wants those areas to be included in form-based code. And we send that back, to the select board. So I agree. I think the building height, it's been clear that that's a community desire, and I want to honor that community desire. Do they then, like, do we get to sort of lay out our arguments for this is a community desire? Here are the reasons it's important, and then they just vote on that? I'm just trying to figure out the process. So that what would be useful for us to do? I mean, I hear, Chapin, I hear your arguments. I'm just like, what is useful information and useful process for us to gather our thoughts here and present it to them? And what's doable versus not doable?
The process here is actually not that you have another hearing. The process is that the select board has to give you an opportunity to essentially comment, which is via the corrected bylaw report and any other memo you'd like to transmit. But this will not, in this process, return to the planning commission for a public hearing. If the select board votes on October 4th to adopt the altered draft, then that's the one that would become law 21 days later. The opportunity the planning commission has the statutory duty to produce this document I've drafted for you, which is, as I said, mostly the same as what you gave to them with transmittal. You can certainly also submit a comment memo and participate in that hearing process. But this is up to the board at this point.
Okay, got it. So
Now, if the planning commission chose to, initiate another bylaw amendment and say, we propose putting this back in, that would go through the planning commission and then select board hearing process.
okay. I mean, I don't want to do that right now because right, I don't want that. I don't want that to slow it down. But I would like to formally lodge that, at least it's my opinion, and I will leave this, obviously everybody else, I want to make sure shares it on the commission, but I mean, my opinion is that this group of people was very swayed by two individuals, and disregarded a very large body of work on public engagement and public input, and that is concerning to me. So I would like to submit that as a additional comment if others agree with that.
I agree. And by the way, before the next hearing, don't we have to publish so many days in advance the draft that they're going to be hearing?
Their draft has been published.
Oh, it has.
Yes.
So there is a draft out there that
Yes.
has these changes in it.
So if you go to mytapcorners.com,
Okay.
you can see a published hearing draft related to the select board's warning of the
Okay.
October 4 hearing.
I was just thinking, as they're really fancy, and I thought that was our hearing. I got it.
Wait, what did you think?
Shayla was reading it as being the planning commission's hearing.
Oh, I
It's the select board's hearing.
Right.
I'll talk.
I just
about
gave
the-
myself a promotion, Megan. It's fine.
Go
Well,
for it,
hey.
Sheila.
So let me talk about the other boundary thing in a minute, but just to say, I think there's a way for the planning commission to work on a comment memo. You probably want to assign a non-quorum group and agree on some general guideposts, and I can help a group of folks, 3 of you write something up if that's desirable.
I think we
Right.
should.
Because to include it in the select board packets, it would need to be done by the 29th, if the meet, that Thursday before the meeting.
Yeah.
And then October 4th, the planning commission has. Or dare we say it, the Blazer specific plan initial review on the agenda and then going on to the select board, so there might not be much time for the commission to like. Or write it and then the commission approves it at 7 o'clock. Like they do minutes and then bring it over to the select board on the 4th, but then it wouldn't be in their packets on the 29th.
No, we should get something in the packet. It should be pre-published so that if other people agree, they can speak to that, having read the packet. So
But
that's,
how can we, okay, so if we draft a memo with a non-quorum number of members, is there a mechanism for the entire planning commission to review the draft and weigh in on it?
Well, I can ask for comment from whoever's not involved in the drafting. And then work with whoever's drafting it on the second round. That's below the level of sort of that total, you know.
and
That's
I think we can
transparent.
authorize you as chair to write something on our behalf.
Well, okay, so my big constraint is I'm leaving for Italy on Sunday and I am not working while I'm gone. And Kate, you're on for October 4th. So I have really constrained time between now and then. And I do agree with these statements and I would personally like to see them expressed to the select board. But I just can't put in a lot of work on it, so.
Could we add one more thing to this, which is not about what the select board did, but there was a lot of public comment in their hearings about what are we doing about affordable housing? And I feel like I'd like our memo to say, by the way, we heard that input and we did not put specific things about affordable housing in this form-based code intentionally because it's our next piece of work we're going to work on. Just want to make sure the public knows that we heard them and that it was not just that we weren't thinking about it.
Yeah, I think it would be good to mention that. I also, if it happens on October 4th or whenever, post adoption of this code, I'll be writing the select board on what comes next memo, which will include an update on our ongoing efforts, which are truly now ongoing related to affordable housing. Things about public works, street specifications, class 1 highways, i.e. town takeover, state highways, stormwater planning and other issues that we identified that need further attention relatively soon. So that'll be another, that wouldn't be for October 4th. It would be once I truly know if something's been adopted or not. But I do want to do that.
Okay,
I know you wanted to say something about the Taft Associates one. Unfortunately, I have to go.
okay, can we do minutes fast? There's no keeping here. and then-
Yeah, well, and I only have one thing to say about minutes.
Okay,
And somebody else had done some of the edits, which was nice, because I think Emily had said, like, in one case, she didn't know what my part was. but
Oh,
it
I did
actually
that,
was-
yeah.
It was actually in there just in the paragraph before.
yeah,
And then there was another statement that I thought was more general, so I moved it, but the one thing is there at the very beginning, the comments I made. It included talking about losing leverage with Taft Associates, Taft Corners Associates, if they, you know, like negotiating about green space and stuff. That to me was one of a list of things. I talked about people not commuting from New York or whatever and being less car-centric. It was one of the many reasons why I felt like it was a bad idea. And I didn't want to list just that one. So I started to try to list them all, and in the end, I just sort of took that out. And that's why it's because I did say that is something I think, but I didn't want to have anybody think that was the reason.
mhm.
So that's what the strikeouts in red are there.
Any further comments on the minutes? Can I have a motion to approve them?
I just
sorry.
added.
Okay,
Sorry,
Sheila.
Megan. I didn't see it and maybe it had been somewhere else. I just added a little piece about affordable housing being the next thing, one of the next things we do at the very bottom.
Great, thank you.
I'll move to accept the minutes as amended.
Okay, thank you. For the second,
I'll second.
Jason second. Okay, all in favor, you raise a virtual or real hand. Okay, like a quorum, Kayla and Ellie. Kate, voting in favor. Is that correct, Kate? Did I, okay, yeah, there's.
Yep.
Yeah, so, okay, thank you, Susan.
Thank you, everybody.
So I am conscious of the time, but I feel like it's really important for us to just hear this last little piece from Matt about sure
Yeah.
the last remaining select board issue, and then we will adjourn.
Sure. So really briefly, the discussion on the JL Davis property was related to their request to take everything south of Marshall Avenue out of the code area. Based on hearing that request and working with the select board to consider it, we identified the compromise position the planning commission considered, which was the 150 feet south of Marshall Avenue, the boundary shift. And that is the one that ultimately the select board went with. So the revised boundary, if you go to mytapcorners.com and look at the revised map, you'll see a boundary for the regulating plan, street specifications, and official map in terms of where the form-based code streets are that ends 150 feet south of Marshall Avenue. So there's some land there that would have been in the form-based code area that instead would remain in the mixed-use commercial zoning district. And I know it can feel like a loss to see land come out of the form-based code district after so much work went into it. I would sort of remind folks to think about some of the slides we went through in March illustrating the difficulty of building traditional big box development in the mixed use commercial district because of some of the requirements that buildings be pulled to the street, et cetera. So I've talked with our stakeholders in that land with Jeff Davis and Jeff Nick, and said, well, guys, I know you don't like the idea of the form-based code being applied there, but you recall the last time you tried to develop a lot under the MUC zoning, it didn't go well because there's all this tension built in to just the existing standards, and they sort of said, well, yeah, we need to work on that. I think there's the possibility to do future work in this area that came out of FBC that could achieve mutual goals for the town and JL Davis Realty. It may be an area that allows some lower height buildings, but imposes some of those streetscape requirements in a way that makes sense for a slightly lower intensity type of retail. But I would not expect, because this boundary moved, for the disputed area to suddenly become a whole lot of big boxes. The development standards aren't there for that to happen. Yeah, that's what that boundary change looks like. So I
So
think
it'd basically be both sides of Marshall Ave.
it's
or
both.
still in it, form-based code.
Right, it's both sides of Marshall Ave with enough depth to continue to allow access to the street fronting stuff to happen from the back. So, this was the discussion at the select board was, did they want to go with something that drew the line down the middle of the road and have really dissimilar development patterns across the street from one another? Or did they want to go for something that would convert Marshall Avenue into a consistent streetscape on both sides? And, going back to the street specs map, remembering there's a cycle track configuration desired there, sort of reflected in the multi-use path that's there today. I think it's a partial win. It's not everything the planning commission transmitted, but it does leave the possibility for sort of an integrated Marshall Avenue that builds out under the code. 150 feet's a lot of depth.
And where some of these streets just kind of dead end into nowhere. We translated that onto the official map with those dashed lines. So the same way we say on the big Mountain View Road parcels, we want to have some street connectivity. We use that same designation here and can use our existing standards to say, yes, continue the street. Yes, we still want Depot to go across and down to Harvest, but it's on the official map, not on the regulating plan.
That's right.
Great. And just for being thorough, nothing from House Senegal?
Well, Mr. Senecal did request a change. He requested a alternate version of the regulating plan on his property that put developable land on both sides of the outer road, and that added developable area to Bur Oak Knoll, and that took the corner of the green space nearest to the highway interchange out of the form-based code area, leaving it in the mixed-use commercial district. The select board opted to not make any of those changes. And I think to some degree, the lack of any infrastructure, a lot of big question marks about constraint. And, you know, as I sort of probably said more times than they wish they heard me say it to the select board, in some ways, the regulating plan and the official map is a wish list and it's a statement of policy. So on land like this, the Senecal land where there's some big question marks about how it could be developed, it's a way of saying this is what a pattern of walkable blocks that respect some conservation areas could look like. And a future plan informed by better knowledge of constraints or desire for development would be compared to something like this. So you'd say, well, those are walkable blocks. If we see something that doesn't create walkable blocks, planning commission and select board might take the guidance from the form-based code text and say, well, that's not quite it. Or they might see something that looked different than this, but did provide the walkability and did provide the view sheds and green space and say, yes, that's different from what we thought, but it achieves those goals. So this stays in, this corner stays in.
Okay. All right,
Before we wrap up,
yeah,
very briefly, future meetings. So October 4th, we will give you time to go over to the select board public hearing. Also on the agenda will be initial review for the Glazer specific plan. So that has been submitted. And we will be preparing a staff report and opening up that discussion of specific plan for the planning commission. And there will not be a meeting on October 18th. Planning staff will be at the NECAPA conference.
Okay.
So a big meeting and then a break.
all right. Great, and could you, with the specific plan, could you make sure, like, if possible, to give us plenty of time to read it before the meeting? Like, more than just Friday to Tuesday, if possible?
I would love that because I want nothing more than to dive into the staff report for it.
Yeah.
So yes, I think we can make that work.
Okay, that would be great,
Yeah.
thank you. Kate, just to clarify, are you okay chairing the October 4th meeting?
Yes, I'll be here.
Okay, perfect, thank you so much. All right, motion to adjourn?
Motion.
Thank you, all right, great, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.